Hey everybody, Gormos here with some more Warthunder ground forces coverage. Now, there are a few things that have changed since the last video, and I want to mention really quick before I go to the main topic of this video, which is spotting and damage model. We have new tier 2 tanks in the game now as well, later versions of the Panzer 3 for example, and the Panzer 4F and F2, and the Stück with L43 cannon. The Russians get more T-34-76 versions, and the KV-1 and the KV-2. Now, the KV-2 was a very powerful tank the last time it was in a test, but one thing I want to say real quick about this tank is, I play realistic battles now of course, and here this tank I think is not that dangerous, at least not at longer ranges, because without the arcade targeting help, it is not that easy to get a hit with your first try at longer ranges, with that low velocity gun, and the reload is extremely long. So you won't see that many KV-2s sniping in realistic battles, and if they do, they need a gunner with a very good aim to do it right. Other new additions from Saturday are fire extinguishers and the requirement for repair parts to repair the tank. But my footage is from Thursday, because realistic battles was not available on the weekend, so I could only play arcade. But I want to focus more on realistic battles for my footage now. Now, there are two other things that are also different in comparison to older versions of the game, but they have been different since a while now. The spotting and the damage model were changed some time ago. The way spotting currently works is this: if a tank is not behind terrain cover, like a hill or a large rock, it will get the name tag. Trees and bushes do not prevent the name tag from appearing, only solid terrain does. If you leave cover, you have the name tag displayed immediately to all tanks that have a line of sight. Again, trees and bushes don't count. And of course, if you see a tank with its name tag, its position is also relayed to all other tanks on your team via the minimap. A few weeks ago, before the spotting system was changed, you did not get the name tags this often, and you had to put some effort into spotting tanks yourself, as you could see in my older videos. In practice, that means that now most tanks are spotted either via the name tag or the minimap most of the time. Now, the damage model has been changed back and forth a lot in the last few weeks as well. First the weapon damage was reduced by a lot, then slowly increased again in every patch, but never reached the level of realism it had in earlier versions of the test. Now, that is still closed beta of course, so it is all subject to change. I am a realistic battle player of course, so I talk about realistic battle game mode when I say this. But I for one would hope that in realistic battles the spotting system gets toned down a bit, maybe even completely removed, and I hope the damage model gets more punishing again, like it was in earlier versions of the test, because I think that in the general suits a realistic tank game better. And in this video I would like to explain why I think that is the case. Let's start with the spotting system. First of all, I think not having the perma spotting really adds a fun gameplay element, having to look for targets yourself, scanning the area and so on. I think you can see very well what I mean by that in my old smoke signals on Kuban video, for example, even though that was in arcade. I put a link to it in the video description if you want to see what I'm talking about. Back then the spotting system was much less effective than it is now, and a lot of the times you had to spot targets yourself, using telltale signs like smokes or trace of fire. I liked that a lot. I think it really added to the gameplay. It was a fun thing to do and made the game feel more realistic and immersive. And I was not the only one who liked it. This got positive comments wherever I showed the video. Even in the World of Tanks forum, where my smoke signals on Kuban video was posted by someone, the idea of having to look for opponents with your own eyes and using smoke and tracers to help you do that was very well received. So not having the spotting system, or at least not in its current form, simply adds fun gameplay elements that are not there if the spotting system is in place. I don't have to look for smoke plumes or other telltale signs, if every tank that I can shoot or that could shoot me is immediately marked by a name tag anyway. I think that makes the game less interesting and immersive than it could be in realistic battle mode. Another thing is balancing, heavy tanks versus faster medium and light tanks. If lighter armored and armed tanks are viable compared to slower but more heavily armed and armored tanks, is heavily influenced by the spotting system and the damage model. Let me give you a little real-life example from one of my Walter Spielberg books. Those books are mostly about technical details of tanks, but also have a small section of field reports by the crews. And I want to give you a short translated quote from a member of a company of Panzer 38, better known as Hetzer. I'm going to call it Hetzer because that's the name everybody uses today. He said, during a firefight, an IS-2 tank fired at the company commander's Hetzer at a range of about 1200 meters, but his shot was about 100 meters short. The company commander immediately ordered a second Hetzer to move to the right and use a depression in the ground to flank the IS-2 while staying in defilade. He took out the IS-2 with a shot in its side. Now I picked that short quote to show that this whole flanking thing I often talk about in my Warthunder tank videos is not just a thing in Warthunder, of course. It is an important part of real tank combat, and if there is no perma-spot system, this works well in Warthunder as well. Again, some of my older closed beta videos show this well. There are a lot of situations where I managed to get into an IS-1's or a Tiger's flank and take him out with a much lighter medium tank or tank destroyer. However, if you change the spotting system to basically a perma-spot system, flanking an opponent becomes much harder. He's most likely going to see you coming, if not because of the name tag, then because of the minimap icon. And that simply means a shift of what is more important to win from tactic and know-how more to who is sitting in the stronger tank, and that is rarely a good thing in a game, realistic or otherwise. Now, one typical argument for such a almost perma-spot system usually is that it supposedly prevents or reduces camping, but I have to strongly disagree. I know it makes sense on paper. If a tank immediately has a name tag for everyone he could shoot, he can't really hide and therefore one would think also not be a camper. However, the problem is that this works both ways. An attacker also gets a name tag as soon as he can fire, and the defender sees everyone coming, so he can pre-aim at the spot the attacker will show up from. That means that whoever is in the best spot first has the best chances, and it is a lot harder to surprise a camper with a flanking move and dig them out. So that's why I think no spotting system, or a much reduced one, works better in realistic battles. Let's take a quick look at why I also think a realistic damage model works better in a realistic game mode. Now, the first argument is of course an obvious one again. It's more realistic and it is supposed to be a realistic game mode. But there's more. I think that a very forgiving damage model is not good for the gameplay in a realistic tank game. I really think so with planes, and I think with tanks this is even more the case. My first argument here comes down to balance between heavy and lighter tanks and flanking again. Now, as I have said already, in my older closed beta test videos, you can see me dealing with heavier tanks in mediums just fine by maneuvering into their flanks. A heavy tank usually has heavy frontal armor and a powerful gun, but is slower. In order to use it properly, you have to drive it in such a way that your heavy frontal armor is facing the enemy and that you don't get flanked. More mobile mediums are better at doing said flanking. That's how you get balance between them. However, this only works if flanking and shooting through the weaker side and rear armor has the effect you would hope for, which would be, in my opinion, to take out the tank you fire at with 1 or 2 penetrating shots into his fighting compartment. If you reduce the damage though and make the damage model more forgiving, you often need a lot more penetrating hits into the fighting compartment to get a kill, and there is a very large chance that even if you flank a heavy tank, you won't be able to do enough damage to it before he turns his tank around and faces you with its heavy frontal armor. Again, favoring the bigger tank over know-how and tactic. Also, the tanks in realistic battles do of course behave somewhat like actual tanks when they move, not like well-armed go-karts. That means, unlike in a more arcade-oriented game, you often can't just turn around and run away even in a medium tank if things are not going your way. And that means you need to plan ahead a bit, and that brings me to my next point. It is hard to plan ahead if you have little idea what you can expect your penetrating shots to do. Sure, a realistic damage model will always have a certain luck factor. However, with a more realistic and punishing version of the damage model, the window, so to speak, of possible outcomes is smaller. Like you can see in my older videos, a penetrating hit into the fighting compartment very often takes out the tank, which makes sense of course. And even if it did not, the second round would usually do the job, and you needed to be very unlucky to require 3 penetrating hits into the fighting compartment to get a kill. Now, with a more toned down and more forgiving damage model, as you can see in the footage, the window of possible outcomes is much larger. You can still get a one-shot, but you can also get situations where you have to fire a very large amount of shells into the tank's flank or rear to get a kill, even if they all penetrate. That makes it almost impossible to guess the outcome of a fight with a bullet sponge damage model. So even if you do everything right, flank a tank, get in his side or rear and fire into his fighting compartment, there is no way of knowing what might happen. Maybe he blows up right away, maybe he takes 5 shells into the crew compartment, turns slowly around and shoots you. Again, it favors heavier tanks with stronger frontal armor, as they, even if they get flanked, have enough time to react and simply turn around and face the person that flanked them. That is why I think a realistic damage model only works if it is actually realistic. If you try to combine a realistic damage model with the bullet sponginess of a hit point bar system, you usually get a very bad and very luck-based and unpredictable system. If you want tanks to soak up lots of penetrating hits, then I'm sorry, but then a hit point bar system works better. Well, that's my opinion on the spotting system and the damage model for realistic battles. I just felt the need to explain why I think realistic spotting and damage model is important for a realistic tank game to work properly. And this is it for this video. As always, I hope it was entertaining, thanks for watching, and maybe I'll see you next time.